The sun was setting over the calm waters of the northern coast, casting a warm glow over the ocean as the crew of the fishing boat Alaska's Pride went about their evening routine. The salty air and the rhythmic sound of the waves had a soothing effect on the sailors, but tonight something would happen that none of them could have anticipated. Captain George Harris, a seasoned sailor who had spent over 2 decades on the open sea, was at the helm, steering the boat towards a nearby cove. His crew members, all of them rugged men who had braved many storms, were preparing for the night's haul, setting the nets and ensuring everything was in order. It was a typical evening until one of the sailors, Tim, spotted something out of the corner of his eye. "Captain!" Tim shouted, his voice filled with alarm. George immediately turned, scanning the horizon. He could just make out a large, dark shape bobbing in the water not far from the boat. At first, he thought it might be a rock or some debris from the rough seas, but then he saw it move. A bear. The sight of a bear swimming in the open water was unusual, and it struck George with immediate concern. The animal appeared to be struggling, its massive body flailing helplessly in the water. Its movements were frantic, as if it was fighting for its life. "Get the lifeboat ready," George commanded, not wasting any time. His heart pounded in his chest as the crew scrambled to prepare the small boat for a rescue. There was no time to waste. The bear was in distress, and it needed help. Tim and 2 other sailors, Pete and David, quickly jumped into the lifeboat, the small vessel bobbing on the water as they made their way toward the struggling bear. George watched them with bated breath from the deck of the ship. This was no ordinary situation. Bears didn't often venture out this far into the open water. Something had gone wrong. The closer they got, the more George's heart sank. The bear was exhausted, its fur matted with water, and its eyes wild with panic. It was clear that it had been swimming for a long time, far from shore, and it was losing the battle. The bear's massive paws splashed the water helplessly as it tried to stay afloat. But with each passing moment, its energy was fading. Tim reached out first, leaning over the side of the lifeboat, and as the bear's head surfaced, he grabbed hold of its fur. The bear let out a hoarse grunt, its eyes locking onto Tim's with a strange, desperate look. Tim had seen his fair share of animals in distress, but this was different. This was a wild creature with no way of knowing who was trying to save it. The bear could have fought back, but instead it seemed to recognize that it had no other choice but to trust these humans. "Hold on," Tim shouted, his voice strained with the effort as the others pulled at the bear's massive frame, trying to hoist it into the lifeboat. But the bear was too heavy, and the boat rocked dangerously from side to side. They needed more strength. With a burst of adrenaline, the 3 sailors worked together, each pushing with all their might, until they managed to get the bear halfway into the boat. The animal's breathing was labored, its large body trembling from exhaustion. It let out a soft, almost pitiful growl as it was lifted onto the boat, its wild eyes scanning its rescuers. For a moment it seemed like the bear might collapse right then and there, but instead it clung to the lifeboat with surprising strength. It was still alive, but barely. "We have to get it back to the ship. Fast!" George called out, urgency in his voice. His crew quickly pulled the boat back toward the larger vessel, the once peaceful sea now choppy from the desperate movement of the lifeboat. As they approached the ship, the bear's movement slowed. Tim, still holding on to the creature's fur, could feel its body relax, as though it had given up the fight. For the first time, there was stillness, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of an animal that was close to giving up. The lifeboat rocked wildly as the sailors carefully maneuvered the bear, still soaking wet and shivering, back toward the Alaska's Pride. Tim, still clutching onto the bear's fur, couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of relief as the ship loomed closer. They had saved the bear from drowning, but now the real challenge was just beginning. Getting the bear safely aboard the ship was no easy feat. "Steady, steady," George called out, his voice strained with anxiety as he prepared the crew for the task ahead. The bear, though still alive, seemed lifeless in their arms, its large body hanging limply over the edge of the boat. Its fur was matted, heavy with seawater, and its eyes, once wild with panic, were now clouded with exhaustion. "We've got to get it inside, quick! The cold's getting to it," Pete said, his voice filled with concern as he helped Tim steady the bear in the boat. "If we wait too long, it won't survive the shock." With a team effort, the sailors slowly and carefully lifted the bear from the lifeboat, hoisting it onto the deck. The massive creature was heavier than any of them had expected, but the sailors' adrenaline kept them moving. They laid the bear on the deck, its chest heaving with every labored breath. It was then that something truly unexpected happened. As the bear lay still, surrounded by the sailors, a strange gurgling noise escaped from its throat. The men froze, their eyes widening as the bear's body jerked slightly, as if waking from a deep slumber. For a moment, no one spoke. It was as though time itself had stopped. Then, in an unbelievable turn of events, the bear let out a soft, almost human-like sound. A low whimper, followed by a deep sigh. Slowly, the bear raised its head, its eyes flickering open. It was alive, more alive than they could have imagined. But what happened next left the sailors utterly stunned. The bear, still weak and disoriented, slowly raised one of its front paws toward Tim, who had been closest to the bear since the rescue. The gesture wasn't threatening. In fact, it was almost tender. Tim hesitated, not sure what the bear's actions meant, but against all instinct, he slowly reached out, and the bear's paw made contact with his hand. In a moment of unspoken connection, the bear nuzzled him gently, as if showing its gratitude. The sailors stood in stunned silence. This was not just an animal in distress. It was a creature who recognized that it had been helped. The bear's reaction was nothing short of remarkable. "Is it thanking us?" Pete whispered, his voice trembling with disbelief. Tim, still holding the bear's paw, nodded slowly. "I think it is." His voice was quiet, almost reverent. The bear, despite its earlier panic and exhaustion, had somehow regained its strength enough to show a silent gesture of appreciation. It was a moment that defied logic and reason, leaving the men wondering if they were witnessing something that no one could truly explain. As the crew gathered around, tending to the bear and its cubs, a sense of awe began to settle in. They had rescued this wild animal from the brink of death, but in return, the bear had shown them something more than they ever expected. It wasn't just a miraculous rescue. It was a bond forged between man and animal, one that would stay with them forever. Drifting back into the cabin of the ship, the crew couldn't help but look at each other, their eyes filled with wonder. What had they just witnessed? They knew they had saved the bear, but in reality, the bear had rescued them too, in a way they couldn't quite understand. As the bear lay on the deck, still recovering from the ordeal, the sailors worked quickly to tend to its needs. They dried it off as best they could, wrapping the bear in warm blankets and keeping a watchful eye on it. The storm that had been brewing earlier seemed to pass, leaving behind a calm sea, but the sailors' minds were anything but calm. The sight of the bear's sudden, almost human-like gesture of thanks had left them in awe. It was as if the wild animal had understood its rescue. Tim, the sailor who had first reached the bear, stood by its side, still feeling the warmth of the bear's touch on his hand. He couldn't shake the thought that this encounter had been more than just a rescue. It had been a moment of connection, one that transcended the natural divide between man and beast. "I've never seen anything like it," Pete said softly, looking at the bear. The creature now lay calmly, its breathing more even, as they sat around the bear, trying to make sense of the surreal experience. The bear's cubs, who had been nestled closely to their mother, began to stir. They were smaller and weaker, but they too seemed to be recovering from the ordeal. The sailors watched with wonder as the mother bear gently nudged her cubs, encouraging them to move closer toward the warmth of the ship's cabin. Tim, still in disbelief, slowly extended his hand once more, unsure of what the bear might do. To his amazement, the bear lowered its head slightly, allowing him to gently touch its fur once more. It was a moment that spoke volumes. A wild animal, once desperate and drowning, now offering a silent gesture of gratitude and trust. The sailors felt a sense of awe settle over them. They had saved a life, yes, but what they hadn't expected was the life-changing lesson in trust and connection that came with it. This wasn't just a rescue, it was a reminder that sometimes in the most unexpected of places, a moment of kindness could bridge the gap between the wild and the human world. As the bear and its cubs were safely moved into the warmth of the cabin, the sailors knew this was a story they would tell for the rest of their lives. But more than that, it was a story about understanding. the unspoken bond between humans and animals that could never be fully explained, but was felt deeply by both.